Hello and welcome to VGM Moments, a podcast dedicated to memorable pieces of video game music. I'm your host Steve Vancouver, and as usual, we'll be talking about the moments in video game music that stuck with us. This could be due to their use in the game, the emotions attached to them, or just because they're excellent pieces of music. Joining me today for our third episode is the writer of an article which happened to be one of the very influences behind this podcast. As part of Laced with Wax, the blog arm of Laced Records, who have distributed a number of well-received video game soundtracks on vinyl and other formats. So I'm very pleased to welcome Tom Quillfeldt to the show. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you. And you pronounced my surname correctly, which has stunned me.
Thank goodness. I was very worried about that. I just realised I hadn't asked you beforehand what your surname pronunciation might be, so it was quite a risky manoeuvre.
Very good. Quill as in the pen, and felt as in the nice soft material
felt
that
tips.
you use. Or felt tip pens.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, there we go. It's German.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me. My first question, I just want to know how you became involved with Laced Records.
So I used to want to be in Radiohead when I was like 17 and was in bands and stuff. And on the side of doing a history degree, I sort of had pretensions to be in the music industry. I got into the music industry, but not as a musician, as a corporate PR of all things. And then whilst I was doing that, I carried on with my love of video games in my spare time, and at some point also video games music as a sort of side thing to that. And then a couple of years ago, when I was going to move on from corporate PR in the music industry, I was looking around, talking to lots of people, taking lots of meetings, doing lots of freelance projects, and I am still freelance at the moment. And I came across a chap called Danny Kelleher who runs Laced Records. He's a proper entrepreneur. He really cares about the products he puts out, and we sort of met up and had a beer, and he didn't really need anything at the time, but we had a good chat. And then when you sow the seeds, when you're sort of job hunting in terms of freelance stuff, you sow the seeds of a list of people you get in touch with, and then eventually, hopefully, they remember to call you when they need something. So we started working together, I think, the middle of 2016. I took over the Laced social media, and I've been running that ever since as a part-time thing for me. And we then launched the blog, I think, in October last year. And the goal was to kind of foster a sense of community, not just around the products of the record label, but of course video game music has this weird sense of community, which strangely in the music industry, I don't know if you get sub-communities that cut across genre, but of course if you're a video game music fan, you might like synthwave, you might like classical music, you might like everything in between, you might like more soundtrack sounding stuff or more sort of licensed tracks. So it was really nice to have the opportunity to kind of invite people to contribute to the blog and contribute ideas and things, do silly listicles. And the piece that you mentioned before, the sort of favourite music moments, I only wrote the beginning of that because of course I had I think 14, 15 or so, maybe more contributors send in their thoughts about their favourite music moments, and that was a really, really lovely piece to put together because
it was great reading all the different picks, like some surprising picks from people who their sort of their game's background and what they're really into, so it's quite interesting to see the pieces that really stood out to them as well. So
and I think when people do things publicly, like I'm now doing this podcast with you, you kind of, if I was to just talk about my 5 favourite music moments, it would all be Final Fantasy, but that would be boring. So I think when people contribute to these things, they maybe try and go for something kind of left field or cool or something that sets them apart.
Absolutely. There's some other great articles you've done on the site. I mean, one of my favourites is the Final Fantasy VI Symphony Breakdown. Did you ever have aspirations as a writer before this, or was it literally just what can I do for Laced Records?
I've never really wanted to be a writer in the sense of write novels or do creative writing or poetry or anything like that. But I think I did want to be a musician, but I was always absolutely rubbish at finishing things. Like I had an EP on the go that I never got round to finishing. But with writing, and I think this is partly to do with the coming of the internet age, it's so much easier to finish a piece and just get it out there. And there's something about the quicker you can finish things, creatively speaking, and just to put them out there, the better you're going to get faster. And of course, the first things you do, the first articles you write or whatever, are going to be mostly rubbish. So the more you can get through, the quicker you can get to sort of doing quite okay ones and then getting to pretty good ones. So because I was in corporate PR, that meant writing a lot of sort of fairly dull press releases and things like that. So I think that's where I got most of my writing practice. And then I reached this fantastic position with Laced where my absolute deepest, darkest, nerdiest passion, which is video games music, crosses over with my ability to write, hopefully write quite cleanly. I sort of, hopefully not too pretentiously, and I go for clarity wherever possible. I guess that's because I too much reading The Economist and their sort of style guide.
You've been with Lace Records, as part of Lace Records, working for them on their blog site for about just under a year, you say. Did you use the site much before? Have you bought a lot of this stuff that they've produced?
Well, full disclosure, in the ironic sense of the term, I don't have a turntable. I'm not into vinyl in that way. I am now, because I've learnt all about it, and I've got some fantastic Lace Records vinyl, but I still got nothing to play them on. I've got nowhere to put a turntable because the baby's toys take up all the room.
I'm sure Baby would love a turntable just to play around with and spin around.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's just put something with a needle where he can reach it.
Perfect. Nice and easy.
So, no, I hadn't really come across Laced in terms of its products. I come across it in terms of its position with the industry because Danny has been involved now for several releases and sort of various projects with Devolver Digital. And the Hotline Miami soundtrack was a bit of a favourite of mine, and it was also this kind of indie darling soundtrack that almost went beyond the game itself in a way. And as far as I understand it, he can correct me later, but I think he has something to do with some of the tracks licensed on there. But anyway, of course, Lace Records then went on to kickstart the Hotline Miami vinyl collector's edition, which came out last year, I believe. So I didn't know of Lace Records beforehand, but certainly knew of the games that they were working in and around. And yeah, it's really exciting to see what's coming up as well, which I can't, of course, mention anything, but there's some really big things coming along the road, and it's getting very competitive in the game vinyl space. I saw beautiful Stardew Valley one the other day, and some of these releases are just sublime, and the thought going into them. And of course, the thing about vinyl is it's just a bigger artistic canvas to paint on, whether it's the gatefold art or the sort of warmth and depth of the recordings. That's if it's done properly.
Well, I'm really looking forward to see what Lace Records do next. Obviously, you can't tell me, so they've had some pretty big releases recently, like No Man's Sky and Ukulele, so very interested to see what is coming up. But for now, I think we'll jump into your list, and your very first piece from a very famous video game composer, which we'll play now. That was the main theme from Final Fantasy VII by Nobuo. I can't even say his name properly. By Nobuo Uematsu. Oh, I'm going to be crucified for that. Tom, could you tell me why this is one of your VGM moments?
Well, it's pretty obvious, really. And I wanted to kind of get this one out of the way first because it's so blimmin' obvious. But it is my strongest game music memory, so it would be a bit of a shame not to bring it up. So I have a sort of half pet theory that with Final Fantasy, and I'm sure this is the same with various series, your favourite in the series is normally the first one you play, particularly if you play it at a very impressionable age, which is kind of, I'd say, like 12 to 16 years old. And for my generation, I'm 32, Final Fantasy VII hit like a ton of bricks. It was this huge, impressive visual thing on the PlayStation. It really set the PlayStation apart. Hugely, at least the trailers made it look very cinematic. But actually, I fell in love with it. The very first video game magazine I ever picked up, they did used to exist, called CVG, back in May 1997, had a double-page spread about the Japanese version of Final Fantasy VII. It just looked so colourful and different, and I had no idea what JRPGs were really at that point. So I kind of was really intrigued from the very first moment I read about it. And yeah, for the very first moment I saw it, I fell in love with it, especially the music when the prelude kicks up at the beginning before the menu screen. And it just sort of entranced me.
Yeah, the music in it is astounding for the time. For those who don't know, obviously, I don't know how you might not know, but this piece is used during when you first enter the world map in Final Fantasy VII. Why do you think this works so well in context as a map theme in Final Fantasy and maybe in overall in RPGs? What do you think sets it apart in that role?
Well, there had already been some fantastic world map music before that. And of course, I guess with my theory about whichever one you play first, if you were slightly older than me and you played Final Fantasy 4 or 5 or 6 first, you might have thought that was the best thing ever and totally revolutionised gaming for you, and you would have fallen in love with the Final Fantasy 6 overworld theme, Terra's theme. But in this case, it's because it's a sort of mini symphony. It starts when you very, very first hear it, and of course everybody talks about that leaving Midgar moment, because if you were playing a JRPG for the first time, you probably didn't really have much of a concept of how long it would be, and you sort of saw that the game came on 3 discs, which was impressive enough. But when you leave Midgar, there's this fantastic, exciting scene with the motorcycle, and then you hit the world map, and it's the first time you've seen it, and it suddenly dawns on you, bloody hell, this is going to be an absolutely gigantic game. And the music, I think it's just over 6 minutes or something, and it starts at a quiet moment when you very first hit the world map for the first time, works through some minor chords before coming to the main melody, and then it just builds into this absolutely grand, epic, sweeping thing, which is impressive enough, and it sounds orchestral despite using the PlayStation sound trip. And you've got the timpani drums, and you've got what sounds like a full orchestra, which of course to that point we wouldn't necessarily have enjoyed on our consoles at least. And then it just takes you on this whole journey by itself. You could leave the character standing still on the world map and still have a symphonic journey. There's a beautiful piano melody supported by all these woodwind counter melodies, and then it sort of sinks into this really dark bit around the 4-minute mark, this weird dark minor section where there's sort of a bit less melody, and it's a bit more moody, and then it comes out of that, and of course it cycles round, but it's just absolutely captivating. And I think probably the reason it's burned into my memory so strongly is the amount of time I spent grinding to be able to beat the Midgar Zolom very early in the game, and my friend and I staying up till like 5 a.m. during high school, and that music just playing over and over and over again, of course punctuated by the amazing but not necessarily bears repeating fighting theme, So you get this big symphony thing, and then suddenly it's punctuated by this really exciting fighting thing. But if you hear that 500 times in a row, it changes your relationships to music slightly.
It loses its lustre just a tiny little bit after the 500th time, I guess.
or it just seeps into your consciousness the same way that, you know, a pop song on the commercial radio might, if you heard it 100 times in a row.
Very true.
I don't know if it's the greatest world map theme ever made. I don't really have much perspective on it relative to other things, because it is so sort of fused with my very strong memories of falling in love with JRPGs. It's kind of difficult. You know, I really love the Ni no Kuni world map theme, Joe Hisaishi. I love the Final Fantasy VI world map theme, although I didn't actually play that game until much later. Final Fantasy VIII has fantastic... Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX, all of these absolutely brilliant world map themes. Even Bravely Default has a really, really brilliant one as well by a guy called Revo. So I'm happy to say that this is the best, and that it sort of will stand the test of time.
Cool. Well, I think for me, I have other world map themes that I prefer, but I'm really impressed with this one specifically, that it's over 6 minutes, and just the variety of that piece, as you mentioned, and it travels a massive thematic distance over those 6 minutes, and it just means that you don't get as used to the music, I guess. It's very you don't hear enough of it repeated too much to be annoyed by it, which I think is quite impressive.
Yeah, and in terms of thematic, is it the first time in the game you hear the theme properly?
I think so, yeah.
So that's as well. I mean, that's a strong, memorable theme. So that as well kind of hits home. And I remember taping it off, somehow connecting a cassette player to the audio out from the TV and recording it on a loop for about 45 minutes, so that I could have a cassette player with some headphones and listen to it to try and get myself to sleep. And I still do that obviously in a digital way now. I still have lots of music I've marked as sleepy and use a lot of video game music to help myself get to sleep, and I have mountains of it now, thousands of tracks, but that was the first track that I really wanted to kind of extract the music from the game and enjoy it on its own and enjoy it separately. And of course people still, you know, I wasn't completely crazy and alone in doing that, because of course you get lots of YouTube videos of extended versions up to kind of half an hour of these tracks, which goes to show that some people somewhere want it playing on a loop.
Do you think that, obviously it's a pretty old piece now using your average MIDI synth quality, do you think it still holds up on its own, or do you think it needs the orchestral versions that have been applied to it?
Like I say, it's difficult for me to kind of hear it relative to other things, because it's so personally tied to fond memories for me. And of course, when I tried to quote unquote obtain earlier Final Fantasy scores when Napster and LimeWire were a thing, I couldn't personally listen to some of the SNES scores because they were too chiptune, they were a bit too basic for me as a listening experience. But then I hadn't played those Final Fantasies to that point. And I'm sure everyone's got a different tolerance to synthesized music and sound chips and MIDI. Some people are so tuned into the PlayStation sound chip they can't bear the early PC MIDI version of the Final Fantasy VII score, which plays with slightly different instruments and doesn't sound as good. It has a very weird kind of different quality. But if I don't think my dad could listen to it and enjoy it the way it sounds now. In terms of the orchestration with, say, Distant Worlds, it's a really tricky one, because the Distant Worlds arrangements follow the originals very closely, don't they?
They do, yeah.
That's their thing. You go to that concert, you're less about the nuts and bolts of the music, and you don't really want to go to hear a clever arrangement that's been pulled apart, say with Final Symphony, which I love as well. But you go for a more faithful kind of direct rendition of it. And it's good. It's fine. The recording I've heard is absolutely brilliant. I don't listen to it a lot necessarily more than the original, so it's difficult to tell. I really love the piano arrangement, which does have a different arrangement, and it doesn't completely stick to the original. And there's something about solo piano that teases out the melody and counter melody and the rhythms and stuff that, in a way, that's the kind of non-chiptune version I prefer the most, because it's abstracted from the orchestral sound of the original.
As we said, it's a fantastic piece to start with, and yeah, I think a lot of people will connect very much with this. Your next piece is very, very different, so we'll listen to it and then we'll have a chat.
Everything's alive.
That was Not Your Kind of People by Garbage, which was originally used, which was used in the Metal Gear Solid 5 Phantom Pain trailer. Now I'm really fascinated as to why you chose a piece of trailer music.
It's the GDC 2013 Phantom Pain trailer that revealed the Phantom Pain as the main part of Metal Gear Solid 5 alongside Ground Zeroes. And the reason I've chosen it is because that trailer sort of reached into my brain and told me and did absolutely everything I could have wanted for a proper Metal Gear sequel to have story-wise. And the marketing for the Phantom Pain up to that point had been totally bonkers, with the kind of fake out, the reveal of the Phantom Pain as a separate game with Moby Dick Studios, and Jeff Keighley interviewing a guy with a bandaged head called Joachim Mogren, and it just being completely nuts and off the wall, which is... but I think people spotted it was Metal Gear Solid 5 pretty quickly because of the way that the text overlaid with something else. Anyway, and it was a couple of months after that had been revealed, and everyone kind of knew it was Metal Gear Solid 5, and then you hit GDC and it all comes out and they sort of officially announced the main game. And this trailer and this music just totally hit me like a ton of bricks. It's just the perfect track. It's the perfect track. And Hideo Kojima, who I'm led to believe makes his own trailers, cuts his own trailers, obviously is a huge music head like Quentin Tarantino. And I assume he chose this track, or someone suggested it to him and he fell in love with it. But it is absolutely perfect, and the trailer is cut to it. The trailer lets the whole song play. I'm sure there's some lyrical crossover as well, although I don't think it's a direct kind of analogue or anything, but it's just perfect. It's just perfect. Everyone should go and find that trailer because it makes the Phantom Pain look like the greatest Metal Gear Solid story ever told. The shame, of course, is that the story was not the best thing about the game. The game was an absolute masterwork in terms of gameplay, and I loved it when it came out. However, the story was a real letdown for all sorts of reasons, mainly not finishing properly or finishing several times and being generally feeling like it was cut very short. But the way I felt about, and I wrote a blog ages ago saying why now is the best time to be a Metal Gear Solid fan, and that was between Ground Zeroes and with this trailer having coming out and excited me so much, but before the game came out in 2015, I just felt that the trailer made me feel so excited there's no way the game could live up to it. And the game did live up to the excitement, but not in terms of sort of fitting into the Metal Gear Solid saga, in terms of the characters and everything that happens in it. So yeah, it's a bittersweet gaming music memory in a way, because it's just such an epic, brilliant, slow song. And Garbage are one of those bands that I'd sort of always respected and liked, but forgotten about to some degree. I'd filed them away with other 90s bands, yeah, like Placebo or Supergrass or Texas or Delamitri or Gomez or the Cardigans. Absolutely brilliant bands, but you just kind of lose track of them if you're not like a dedicated fan of one of those. And Placebo's still going, releasing great stuff. Gomez is still going. And as far as I'm aware, Garbage regrouped in 2011, and this was their 5th studio album in 2012. And it's just an amazing track, and it's slow, it's moody. There's some fantastic kind of James Bond-esque twanging guitar in there, and this kind of faltering drum beat that just makes everything so dramatic. And the way the trailer is cut and what the trailer shows as well, if you knew your Metal Gear Solid lore at that point, it was really, really exciting, because it's the trailer where there were hints about Volgin from Metal Gear Solid 3, there was a child Psycho Mantis, and there's so many hints in that trailer as to what the eventual plot twist, personally speaking, I thought mishandled plot twist of the Phantom Pain main game.
Mm-hmm.
But there's all these tiny little teaser things through in there. You hear Kiefer Sutherland's voice as Vic Boss, as Venom Snake at the end, and you're like, hang on a minute, that's not David Hayter. And then he's got the stupid shrapnel horn, which is full of kind of meaning or whatever. And then there's a weird lady says V has come too, and then it says there's two foxes or something like that, which immediately makes you think, they're two big bosses or what's going on. And the reason it's so exciting before the game came out is because all of that potential for kind of Kojima messing with you was still intact there, and you knew that the character had come out of a coma after 9 years, and it was just absolutely magical. The trailer just totally gripped me. I think it's the best trailer for anything I've ever seen in terms of its effect on me.
Yeah, I've got to say, I only restarted playing Metal Gear Solid after the third game, so I had to look this up when you sent me your list, and I have to admit that is a really good trailer. Like, I think the only trailer for me that did the same sort of thing was the Breath of the Wild trailer when that was initially announced, and the musical impact of that had the similar effect, I'm guessing, as it had to you. It fit what was going on absolutely perfectly. I'm guessing you're quite a big Metal Gear Solid fan?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't. Metal Gear Solid 3, funnily enough, is the only one I haven't played, which is the best one in the series. I've watched someone play through it on YouTube, but that doesn't really count. No, I'm sort of a half of a Metal Gear fan. I am a big fan, but I don't experiment with the games and sort of push them to the limits mechanically. And with the actual storyline, I don't take any of it seriously. I'm just kind of like a rabbit in headlights. I'm just absolutely stunned by the sheer convolutedness of the story and how bonkers it is. And it's a different kind of bonkers to say, if anyone knows the Final Fantasy 13 Fabula, Crystal and Novalis story across those three games, if you try and read the Wikipedia entry for for Lightning Returns, or any of the Kingdom Hearts games for that matter, you just think, man, what were they smoking when they wrote this story? And it's you could kind of say the same with Metal Gear Solid's overall saga and how everything relates and the bonkers, the way everything ties together, except that it's based around a skeleton of real world happenings, historical things, military things, and Kojima's got so tantalizingly close to predicting or commenting on real world issues, like with Ground Zeroes. I remember Rich Stanton, who was writing for Eurogamer at one point, he's now with Kotaku, wrote a brilliant thing about Ground Zeroes being the only game that's ever commented on Guantanamo Bay, for instance, and also the way that Metal Gear Solid 2, much derided but very postmodern work overall, in the way that it talks about the dangers of the internet and junk information at the end of that game. Really, really prescient, and that was written 2001 or something. So for that reason, I'm a fan of the overall Metal Gear Solid thing, whilst still being able to recognise that, say, Metal Gear Solid 4's cutscenes are absolutely ridiculous, and its gameplay quite restricted in some of the games, and so I'm not completely bought in. But I was at the height of my interest in it, I think, just before number 5 came out. Loved number 5 as a game much more than the other games, but unfortunately the story just sort of didn't hit home. It just didn't feel finished. It didn't feel as impactful as Metal Gear Solid 3, 2, 1, Peace Walker, which is a brilliant game as well and a brilliant story.
Well, we could talk about Metal Gear Solid for quite some time, given its its crazy storylines, and a whole essay could be written on Metal Gear Solid 2. Lots
of essays have been written about Metal Gear Solid 2. And on that point, it's worth, I think there's a Gamasutra piece, it's well worth everybody looking up, about Metal Gear Solid 2 as a postmodern comment on, I think, otaku. Kojima kind of not having a go, but maybe having a bit of a go about his fans of the first game, and it's fascinating. Gamasutra, look it up. It's quite an old article, but it's absolutely fascinating.
Fantastic. We shall move on to the next piece, a game which returns for the first time in this series. We shall listen to this now, and then we'll talk about it. That was Clouds and Starlight from Everybody's Gone to the Rapture by the wonderful Jessica Curry. Tom, could you explain to me why this is on your list?
Well, it's absolutely beautiful. It's possibly one of the best video game scores ever recorded in terms of its sophistication, obviously choral work. And I listened to the score before I played the game for the first time. For whatever reason, I think it came on Apple Music or Spotify or something. And Jess was already quite famous as a video game composer within video game circles, thanks to Dear Esther, mainly, and I sort of fell in love with her work through that. I met her at Game Music Connect one year. She's a very nice lady. Played Everybody's Gone to the Rapture and thought it was a beautiful game overall, just a work of art for so many reasons, including the music. And this was a really stunning moment in that game. However, I didn't feel that necessarily that strongly about it the first time, or at least I can't really remember. But after that first playthrough, I met Jess several times. I wrote up an article for Gamasutra about her keynote at the Women in Games 2016 conference. A very passionate plea. She's very outspoken about industry issues and about just how sort of retrograde the industry is in terms of working practices and attitudes, and she really didn't hold back. And the kind of more you hear her speak, and the more she's a really inspiring person as well as a brilliant composer, and she's a warrior for workers' rights in the and women's rights in the music industry. I'm not in the video games industry. I'm not in the video games industry, and I'm not a woman, and I'm still inspired. So I sort of wanted to go back to Everybody's Gone to the Rapture and really dig into it maybe a bit deeper than I did the first time. So I got my paper out and my pen, and I started drawing diagrams about where all of the audio, where all of the sort of the scenes played out in terms of the map and what everybody's relationship was to each other. Because I'd read a fantastic piece by Kirk Hamilton, Kotaku, kind of trying to piece all this together. And it's one of those games where you can, like a Christopher Nolan film like Inception or something, where you can kind of dig into the film or the game's internal lore. And unlike Metal Gear Solid, where it's this whole saga across loads of games, it's kind of this self-contained thing, but it's got enough about it. And of course, that's down to Dan Pinchbeck's wonderful writing and story. And I've met him and Jess a couple of times now, had good long chats with them. So I sort of feel a bit of a personal bond to this game coming back to it. And there's this moment, sort of in the middle of the game, I guess, where a 16-year-old girl, you see everybody's last moments, but there's one that's absolutely devastating where you're walking around this desolate, rather deserted holiday camp, and it's raining, and there's this beautiful kind of bright light through the clouds, and then this eerie voice on a tannoy, like a ghost, calls you to the town hall, and you've been watching this story of it's Lizzie's section of the story, but there's a girl, Rachel, 16-year-old girl, and her sort of boyfriend Reese, and they want to run away together, but it doesn't quite work out. And Rachel ends up in the town hall where she's been helping put on a production of Peter Pan for all of the children in the village who, and the production is just to keep their minds off what's going on with the kind of supernatural events and people going missing. And so they're all camped out there. There's all these beds laid out and some absolutely heartbreaking kind of environmental design, and they've put all their effort into this Peter Pan production. And you come to this scene, and Rachel's holding baby Dylan, who is someone else's baby, who she's literally been left holding the baby, and she's kind of half singing, half sobbing to it. The lyrics, I think it's the second verse of this song, and then the song comes in, Jessica Curry's song Clouds and Starlight, and it just sends every single, hair on your body standing up. You're just transfixed and upset and mesmerized. It's such a beautiful, dramatic moment. And I'm sure if you wanted to make fun of walking simulators and denigrate or diminish games with a more emotional, artistic intention, this moment would be one of kind of mawkish, sickly sentimentalism for you, and it would really be overbearing. But if you're swept up in the game and the writing and all the stories of these different people, it just grabs you by the heart and just keeps you there. And then you see the after image, that you hear the planes go over and spoilers drop Nerf gas on everybody in the valley to try and stop the infection, what they think is an infection, getting out. And so you see everybody's last moments as light that drifts away, and you see all the children lying down on the beds on the floor, and the piece gradually sort of fades out. And it's just so it's just so well done. It's absolutely masterful. Video game writing, everything is incredible.
Yeah, it's such a stunning moment, I think, especially because of what happens straight afterwards. You get little clues alluding to what is going to happen, but when you hear the planes going over and the music swells at that point, it was a very touching moment. I think it's usually it's actually quite a major part of the genre of games, the music, I think. Do you think that's where the biggest steps in video game music are being made right now?
No, not necessarily. I mean, video game music's as wide as the industry. You've got people doing crazy experimental generative stuff like Olivier Desrivières with Get Even, and obviously Remember Me before that. You've got people doing amazing kind of synthwave and chiptune stuff still, and stuff like Crypt of the Necrodancer and music-based games, and it's so wide. You got Gareth Coker doing huge Hollywood orchestral, beautiful stuff, and it's all genres. That's the thing. Video game music is not one genre. Wonderfully, it'd be horrible if it was. However, obviously, narrative adventure games, as you described them, have a certain gentler pace. And I think it's possibly easier to find some artistic breathing space in there to write something as beautiful as this. It helps that Jess is a proper composer and stuff. She's bringing. She co-founded and co-ran a video game studio, so she's definitely in the video games industry. Although I think she was leaving it at one point. But she's bringing so much outside influence into video games. And I think that's the most interesting thing about this, and why it's so important, is because, it gets played on Classic FM. She obviously had a show on Classic FM. And someone who likes classical music might hear it and think, that's nice, that's really lovely. And they may or may not think it's the best thing ever. But when they hear it's a video game score, it hopefully has the power to kind of change perceptions that video game scores don't have to be hyperactive chiptune music, although there's some absolutely brilliant hyperactive chiptune music in video games. Yeah,
I'm really excited to see, maybe I won't see it, the lasting impact of that specific soundtrack in the classical sphere, seeing how it, if it can stick, because I think if any video game classical music score has got a chance, it's got to be this one, because it hits all the buttons. It's a wonderful soundtrack to the video game as a companion, but on its own, it's fantastic as well. So I'm really, really hoping that one does stick, and I'm really looking forward to see what she does with So Let Us Melt in the future. We'll move on now onto another licensed piece of music, which is quite interesting. So we'll have a listen to it, and then we'll jump into it. That was Afterlight by the artist, I guess, Rusty, from the game Sleeping Dogs. Now, as I said, Tom, this is very, very different. What's the reason for choosing this then?
This is, the reason for choosing this is to deliberately not just pick soft and soppy stuff, because that's what I would naturally tend towards. This is a strong game music memory, and the memory specifically is racing around, I think, the docks in Hong Kong in Sleeping Dogs, and quite enjoying the driving, although a lot of people complained about it. But the grippiness, when you sort of went over a jump and your tyres gripped on the motorcycle specifically, and then you zip off, and they've got these like flares for markers on the racetrack, and a fantastic licensed soundtrack for Sleeping Dogs. And because the production wasn't quite as big as any Grand Theft Auto game, what I understand they did is they went to quite specific record labels like I think it's Roadrunner, could be wrong about that, but definitely Warp Records as one of them, and got them to basically curate a whole radio station. So whereas Grand Theft Auto will pick tracks from all over and make like an 80s radio station or a jazz radio station or whatever, or hip hop, Sleeping Dogs did it slightly more strategically. And Warp Records is a UK label, independent label, very well known within those scenes, the label of Aphex Twin, among many, many others. And this Glaswegian electronic artist called Rusty has been putting out laser hip hop. Some call it maximalism. It's part of trap, sort of, post dubstep. Because of course in electronica music you've got to have 8,000 subgenres for everything.
I was going to say, some of these things I've never heard of. I was nodding along going, yeah, post dubstep.
Well, you would have... The other person, again, Scottish guy who came out of that scene is Hudson Mohawk, who did the Watch Dogs 2 soundtrack recently and has also worked with Kanye West. So the interesting thing, so that the memory is racing these motorcycles around in Sleeping Dogs, which I really loved the game. I thought it was brilliant. Such a shame it didn't get a sequel. Wasn't able to kind of become a counterpoint series to Grand Theft Auto. Generally really enjoyed the game, but that specific moment hearing this track kick in, and it's got these amazing kind of ba 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 ba, these pulses that push against the tempo, the pulse, and you're just feeling like $1 million. You know, any Grand Theft Auto game, you have those a million moments where the just the right song hits at just the right moment if you're doing something awesome or bonkers or whatever. But this really matched up as well and really hit home. And it also is a very strong memory for me because I used to be, at one point in the music industry, I was a music manager. I managed a very good friend of mine, artist called Bobby Tank, who was making music in a world I did not understand at all. But because we were buddies and because I was making my way in the music industry, we decided to team up, and I got him a record deal, and we worked really hard around kind of 2012, 2013 trying to get him up and running. Although of course he was already making fantastic music to that point, but trying to get him going in the industry. And we went on a real kind of adventure together. And we'd tour festivals and stuff. We played Glastonbury and Secret Garden Party and festivals abroad. We had a really exciting time, and his sound was also maximalism. You can go and look up Bobby Tank. It's absolutely bonkers sound. There's a track called Afterburn, which was in some ways his breakout track, which got played by Zane Lowe on Radio 1. And just one Radio 1 play, a sort of like, here's the new hot track, you get all the major record labels calling you, and suddenly everybody's interested, and it gets played on XFM and other places. And it's an absolutely brilliant track. But Rusty was around, kind of contemporary of his. And Bobby used to, when he used to do sets, he'd play this track a lot. And he loved it as well. And when you're in a club at 3 a.m. and you hear something as powerful as this over gigantic speakers just deafening you, and everybody else was on drugs. We were working, obviously, so we were compos mentis. But this track is just one of a whole range of really brilliant tracks out of that scene. Kind of it is post dubstep. It's kind of cleverer and slightly more intellectual than, I guess you'd say, American EDM that kind of came about contemporaneous with that slightly after. But so it's the fusing of these two things. This wonderful game I loved, this feeling of racing around on motorcycles that had this particular grippy thing, combining with this track that also reminded me of loads of fun times being an artist manager, make it a really weird, idiosyncratic music moment.
I guess it's actually a really good thing for. I have no idea if Rusty was very big before this, but being in a game as part of a radio station must be quite a good way for people to discover the music who might not have even thought about them before.
Absolutely, yeah. There's lots of complications where you get to kind of copyright and fees and how much people get paid versus how much they are sold on that exposure, whether an artist or not licenses a track to a game. And still slightly the Wild West with video games and licensed tracks. It's not quite as straightforward as film. And also it gets more complicated when games are online and might be being streamed and you get into stuff with mechanical copyrights and blah 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 blah. Anyway, I hope Sleeping Dogs brought people to Rusty and other Warp artists. Warp put several different artists on that particular radio station. And yeah, Grand Theft Auto, as we know, turns people on to a lot of different whole genres, jazz and classical and stuff, let alone individual tracks or artists in general. It can, and especially, I don't know how involved Rusty was with Sleeping Dogs. I assume not very. I assume it's the record label that did the deal and work closely, and he might have just been told about it once and he'd be like, yeah, cool, whatever. Or he might be a massive gamer and loved it, I don't know. Obviously, like I say, his contemporary Hudson Mohawk clearly loves gaming, and to actually compose a whole original soundtrack for Watch Dogs 2. And Bobby Tank, the guy I managed, also loves video gaming as well. So I think that genre actually fits really, really well with video games generally.
Well, moving on from licensed piece, we go back to a piece written specifically for a game, but still slightly different from your usual idea of video game music. So we'll jump onto this. This is a fascinating selection. So let's play the music, and then we'll talk about this wonderful song.
Yo soy el mariachi solitario de las one's noble line. My people care only for robots and Martian invaders. But for birthdays they say maybe later, we don't have the time. Mariachi, I come back from the future and pick up young versions of me. In our spaceship, we set course through the time stream and filled Gringo's birthdays with glee. Por favor, don't freak out if you see mariachis extraños. It's just me y mis vatos who wish you feliz cumpleaños. But spaceships like this are expensive, even more when they travel through time. And singing for birthdays on spec makes us poco dinero. So we took on a contract and that's our new boss to co-sign. Mariachis, we take souls of the damned and we send them to places unknown. Through that portal, although first we must crush them with gigantic heads made of stone. Where they go, we don't know, but it's hot, maybe it's Ensenada. And as long as we still get to sing, no importa nada. When we say adios or December, please try not to cry. We were there for your birthday, we'll see you again when you die.
That was La Canción de los Mariachi from Sam & Max Season 2, Episode 4, written by Jared Emerson Johnson. Tom, tell me about this piece.
This guy is a genius, Jared Emerson Johnson, and I'm not sure many people knew about him until he got BAFTA nominated for The Walking Dead, Telltale's The Walking Dead in 2013. But prior to that, he'd done some absolutely mad, zany, jazzy, amazing stuff for all sorts of crazy Telltale games and other stuff. I just wanted to give him a massive shout out because he's amazing. There's some really crazy stuff on those first three Telltale Sam & Max series. Obviously Sam & Max is an older property as well. And I don't know if those are even particularly well regarded Sam & Max entries, but I played them with my wife. We played quite a few adventure games together over the years, and those were particularly funny and well voiced and just stupid. And it reaches its climax of stupid in the second season, where there's a running it's like the thing with Telltale's episodic model before The Walking Dead made it a thing, and they were doing it well before that, is that a couple of times they kind of showed the potential of being able to do callbacks and running gags. And I think it's just within season 2, there might be in season 1 as well, there's this gag that when anyone says birthday, these mariachis turn up and start singing about somebody's birthday, and it's totally random, and then they just disappear. And then you get the payoff in this particular episode where it turns out that they are intergalactic time travelers who what do? They kidnap younger versions of themselves or something like that. It's totally nuts. But the first lyrics, or some of the first verse lyrics of it, I come back from the future and pick up young versions of me in our spaceship. Aye, 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 aye. We set course through the time stream and fill gringos' birthdays with glee. And it's just, and they do this whole kind of couple of minutes song in the middle of a game. I'd never seen that in a game. It's this kind of, I guess Monty Python-esque random sense of humour, nutty, zany, off-the-wall sense of humour. But they'd set up the gag already. And yes, really made us laugh, and I really remembered it quite strongly because it was out of left field, let's just say.
Yeah, it's quite different from the original Sam & Max, in the sense that they've both got the humour, but Sam & Max tended to combine the humour with a more serious style of music to make it sort of put a magnifying glass on the humour. It's like backed by a serious score just makes it seem even more silly what's going on. Do you have a preferred way of showcasing humour like that in these games? Would you prefer like a serious for a silly setting, or the other way around? What do you think one works better than the other?
Gosh, I don't know. That's a pretty esoteric question. Humour in games is a real hit and miss, isn't it, over the years? It's a bit like proper emotional drama in games. It's just not been done well enough, consistently enough compared to other visual media to really be able to extrapolate what works or what doesn't. We know that it's really hard to do humour in video games, as evidenced by the fact that there's very few funny video games. You've got like Jazz Punk, South Park, and
even then South Park's based on a TV series anyway, so it's not
true, but they bring their humour to bear on video games in a way that's very sensitive to the medium. And actually I remember the South Park music being quite serious and atmospheric. It
was actually, wasn't it? It had that sort of Skyrim-y feel to.
But they were sending it up.
Yeah.
They were subtly sending up the Skyrim music without it kind of being as daft and in your face as this song that just suddenly plays in the middle of a Sam & Max episode. But it's a tricky one. Those Sam & Max games, the music is quite front and centre. Actually, it's quite in your face, and the trouble with looping music in adventure games is if you get stuck, which you will, the loops, like a Final Fantasy game, can begin to kind of wear you down after a while. There's certain tracks in Sam and Max where that happens, where it's brilliant, inventive music, lots of woodwinds and live stuff, and kind of wacky. Everything's wacky in those games, but actually, when you've been stuck on a bit and you can't work out what to do, those tracks can weigh you down a little bit. I remember that being the case with maybe slightly less so with the absolutely brilliant Grim Fandango score by Peter McConnell. This amazing jazzy score with real instruments, but some really awkward puzzle solutions that just have you stuck for ages and hating the music after the third hour of standing in the same room clicking on stuff and hearing the same dialogue over and over again. And humour, and there's a whole other conversation to be had about humour in adventure games, full stop, just the difficulties of that, and people getting stuck and something that was funny the first time not being funny the 10th time.
I think if any genre gets humour right, though, it probably is the adventure genre series, because it's more... I think it allows itself to be sent up a bit more than something like an action game that tries to make jokes within it, I guess.
Yeah, and I came fresh to Sam Max with the Telltale stuff, so I'd never played the originals. So it had the benefit of having that kind of established humour and tone and callbacks and stuff. And you either bounce off that or you get swept up by it, because they're very charming characters. It's a very silly game. And we just got swept up in it, really loved it, played all 3 seasons, kind of hoped for more, really. I don't know what happened there. Presumably just one of those franchises that wasn't going for them, and then they took off with The Walking Dead and everything completely changed for Telltale.
What's quite interesting about your picks, apart from obviously Final Fantasy VII, is that 4 of them have vocals in them. Do you think the vocals help you connect with the experience, or do you think it's just a happy coincidence?
I hadn't thought of that. I think we've got vocals in... 3 of them have vocals on.
Oh yes, Afterlight isn't really a vocally, is it? I forgot that.
2 of them have lyrics which specifically refer to the game, what's happening in the game. So Clouds and Starlight and the Mariachi song are sort of quite closely tied in, and the garbage tracks are a trailer. No, I'm if anything, I'm much more of a fan of instrumental video game music.
Okay.
But I don't know. These stuck out in terms of music memories. I remembered them, but there's so much instrumental stuff, and it's mainly like ambient stuff. You hear hooks when you're walking around Fallout 3 or Horizon Zero Dawn or any of these gigantic video games. You'll fall in love with quite backgroundy pieces of music sometimes, because they're much less, say Western games, The Witcher or something. These pieces are much less in your face, of course, than JRPG, the tradition of JRPGs, where when the text is written before JRPGs were voiced, the music plays so much of a part setting the character, and you have these monophonic melodies that really kind of carry you through and set the mood of the place and the characters. But with Western games, it's much closer to the background, and I love all sorts of those pieces, but they don't have strong gaming memories. They have sort of fond gaming memories, but these ones, I don't think it's got to do with the vocals. I think it's the tracks I've picked. It's got to do with specifically the games and the way the games made me feel. Final Fantasy in terms of the grand epic world map, garbage, the Metal Gear Solid trailer in terms of how it made me feel about the Metal Gear Solid saga to that point and how excited I was for that I was going to continue. Jessica Curry, Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, the absolute peak dramatic emotional moment of that. Sleeping Dogs, just the feeling of speeding around these tracks with a fantastic licensed soundtrack that was really off the beaten track in terms of experimental cutting edge electronica. And then Sam and Max is completely daft.
Yeah. Do you think your mix of styles and genres in your choices represents your overall taste in game music, or do you have something that you...
No, not in the slightest. My taste in music overall, everybody says this now in the Spotify age, but it's hugely eclectic. everybody says this hugely eclectic these days, so it's not an impressive thing to say. It's quite a bland thing to say. In terms of video game music, my tastes trend towards everything Final Fantasy, just those moods, that aesthetic, that type of very melodic stuff. And then generally more mellow, chilled out stuff, just generally. So Everybody's Gone to the Rapture and Final Fantasy VII are most indicative of the kind of video game music I really love. So yeah, but it would have been really boring to bring in 5, because I could have brought in Skyrim, but obviously Priscilla picked Skyrim. But I could have brought in Flower, these really beautiful chilled out things. The main theme of LA Noire, track from Braid called Downstream. There's some stuff from To the Moon, which is really nice, and those are all lovely, but they don't have necessarily as strong memories as these 5. And then the only exception to all of that is Streets of Rage 2, which is the greatest thing anyone's ever made, and the kind of techno house Yuzo Koshiro stuff of that is just amazing, absolutely out of this world.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for joining us. It's been really enjoyable, really interesting talking about these pieces. Is there anything you're currently doing that you'd like to tell people about?
Yes, well, I'm continuing doing the blog at Laced with Wax, so I would very much encourage people to check out Laced Records, our social feeds, to get news of both new products, of which there will be some absolute stormers later this year, some real biggies, and then also you'll see all the articles get posted up on there, of course, from Laced with Wax. Hopefully there's some very interesting pieces coming up, and interviews and all sorts of things. I try and be as creative as possible across stuff as wide as like vinyl production, the art for some of the products, but also game art in general. I've got a blog coming up about music, how a particular song was implemented in a big franchise game, interviews with composers, stupid listicles, which everybody loves, for wasting 5 minutes. I think we're going to move the blog URL soon, so saying lacedwithwax.com is a good place to go might not be a good place to go by the time someone listens to this, so best to check out laced_records on Twitter, and find us on Facebook, and we'll be posting everything there.
Brilliant. Yeah, I completely second what Tom says. There's some great articles that have been written, as I mentioned earlier on, and as I said, really looking forward to what's coming up on Laced Records slate. Thank you very much for listening to the show. This is the first episode I can say that we have a Twitter account and a Facebook account and a YouTube account. So on Twitter we are VGM_moments, and on Facebook and YouTube we are just VGM Moments. Do your subscribe, etc. thing if you like what you heard, and hopefully you'll join me next time for some more video game music moments.